Imagine being accused of squatting at your own cabin in front of neighbors and law enforcement, then proving not only that it's yours, but that you own their homes too. Imagine pulling into a place you've known your entire life, only to have someone tell you that you don't belong there. That was the situation facing Silas Trenholm on a warm Friday afternoon in early June. He had driven nearly 3 hours from Charlotte, his old pickup stacked with fishing gear, a cooler packed with food, and a battered binder of documents he carried everywhere when it came to land. For him, this wasn't just a weekend retreat. It was a return to the one place where he felt his grandfather's presence most. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, framed by tall pines that stretched toward the sky. Silas eased the truck down the gravel path, each turn of the wheels crunching against the stones, and parked near the cabin his family had built decades earlier. The cabin wasn't much to look at, wood darkened by time, a front porch sagging just slightly, and a tin roof that rattled in storms. But to Silas, it was perfect. It wasn't about appearances. It was about roots. As he stepped out, he let out a long breath, taking in the fresh smell of water and earth. "Finally," he muttered, setting his boots onto the ground like they belonged there. He pulled his rod from the back, checked the tackle box, and smiled to himself. After weeks of long contracts and demanding clients, he finally had space to breathe. But here's the thing. Silas wasn't just any man with a weekend getaway. Over the years, while others were busy arguing at town meetings or building subdivisions, Silas had been making quiet moves. Buying land, negotiating parcels, signing deals when others didn't even notice. And eventually, piece by piece, he ended up holding deeds to almost everything surrounding that lake. Roads, shorelines, even the wooded trails people used without a second thought, they all fell under his name. Silas owned more than most knew, and he liked to keep it that way. He carried his cooler inside, setting it on the worn kitchen counter. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but it was home. He pulled back the curtains, letting sunlight filter across the wooden floorboards. He set down his grandfather's pocket knife on the table, a ritual of sorts. Every visit began and ended with that knife in plain view, a reminder of the man who taught him what hard work meant. Just as he was preparing to head back out for more gear, Silas heard something unusual. It wasn't the call of birds or the rustle of leaves. It was a sharp voice cutting through the still air. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" He turned to see a woman marching up the drive, her posture stiff, her sunglasses flashing like mirrors in the sun. She wore a tailored blouse and carried a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her stride was quick, her tone sharp, and her eyes locked on him like he was trespassing in her backyard. Silas wiped his hands on his jeans. "Afternoon. Can I help you with something?" The woman planted herself at the edge of the porch steps. "Yes, you can explain why you're unloading things at this property. Are you renting it? Because we have strict rules about short-term stays here." Silas tilted his head, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Renting it? Ma'am, this is my cabin." She gave a tight laugh, the kind people use when they don't believe a word you've said. "That's not possible. This area falls under the jurisdiction of the Lakeview Homeowners Association, and I don't recall approving anyone by your name." He let out a slow breath, already sensing this wasn't going to be a 2-minute conversation. "Name's Silas Trenholm. My family's owned this place for generations." "Maybe you're mistaken," but she crossed her arms, unmoved. "I don't make mistakes about property in this community. My name is Marjorie Kincaid, president of the association. And if you don't have documentation showing you belong here, you'll need to leave immediately." The words hit him like a sudden storm. After years of working, buying, and protecting this land, being told he was an intruder here almost felt comical. Almost. He studied her expression, though, and realized she wasn't joking. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "I think you're a little out of line, Mrs. Kincaid." You don't know who you're talking to, but her glare only hardened, and in that instant he understood this confrontation was just beginning. But before Silas could explain himself, Marjorie doubled down, setting the stage for a clash that would soon draw more eyes than either of them expected. Silas leaned against the porch rail, his arms folded loosely, watching the woman in front of him, as if she had walked straight out of a board meeting and into his driveway. Her tone, her stance, even the clipboard clutched under her arm, it all screamed authority, or at least the need to project it. Marjorie Kincaid didn't back down. She narrowed her eyes behind her sunglasses. "I asked you a question, mister." "Trenholm, are you renting this place, or squatting? Because either way you're in violation of our community standards." Silas chuckled under his breath, a dry sound, and shook his head. "Squatting? Lady, I've been coming to this cabin since I was a boy. My father brought me here before you were even thinking about HOA bylaws, and you're standing on my land right now." That only seemed to provoke her further. She stepped closer, heels crunching against the gravel, her voice rising. "No, you're mistaken. All the lakefront property around here is under the authority of the Lakeview Association. We've had issues with people sneaking in, renting out cabins, throwing parties. I'm not about to let some stranger set a precedent." Silas's jaw worked slowly as he studied her. He could feel his patience thinning, but he wasn't about to let anger lead. That wasn't his way. "I don't know what you think you know, ma'am, but I assure you, this cabin's mine, and so's the land around it, every foot of it." Her laugh was short, sharp, like a gavel hitting a desk. "You expect me to believe that? One man owns all of this?" She waved her hand toward the tree line, the lake shimmering in the background. "That's absurd. Do you even hear yourself?" "Yes," Silas said simply, meeting her stare. "I do." For a moment there was silence between them. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, like two boxers circling each other, waiting for the next move. A pair of kayakers drifting on the water slowed down, noticing the exchange. Even a jogger on the far path paused, pulling an earbud out to listen. Marjorie broke the silence first. "Listen, Mr. Trenholm, or whoever you claim to be. I don't know what scheme you're running, but rules are rules. If you don't provide documentation immediately, I'll have to contact the authorities." Silas exhaled, long and measured. He wasn't shocked. That much was clear from the steady look in his eyes. He'd seen people like Marjorie before, people who believed authority was theirs by default, who assumed their word carried more weight than the truth itself. But the way she dismissed him so quickly struck something deeper. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "I don't answer to your rules. I've got more paperwork in that cabin than you've got in that clipboard. Deeds signed, sealed, and recorded. My grandfather bought the first plot back in 1949. I've been buying up land ever since. You can call whoever you want, but nothing changes the fact that this is mine." His words didn't move her. If anything, her grip on the clipboard tightened. "You can talk all you want, but talk doesn't prove a thing. You're standing on HOA-controlled property. That's trespassing." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Trespassing? On my own porch?" He couldn't help but laugh, the absurdity bubbling up despite the tension. "Lady, you're standing on my land right now, accusing me of being where I've been since I was 12 years old. If anyone's trespassing, it might be you." That line drew the first ripple from the small crowd gathering at a distance. A few neighbors shifted closer, whispering. Phones began to appear in hands, screens glowing as lenses captured the exchange. Marjorie noticed the attention but refused to back down. She lifted her chin. "Enough of this. I've asked you nicely. If you don't pack up and leave, I'll have no choice but to call the sheriff." Silas didn't flinch. He stared at her for a long moment, then glanced at the gathering neighbors. "Go ahead," he said finally, voice calm, almost weary. "Call them. I'll be right here when they come." The words hung in the air. Marjorie shifted on her feet, clearly expecting him to panic or scramble for an excuse. Instead, his calm only unsettled her more. "Don't think I won't," she shot back, fishing her phone from her purse. Her fingers flew across the screen as she muttered into the receiver, "Yes, I need deputies at Lakeview Subdivision immediately. There's a suspicious man refusing to leave private property." She shot Silas a pointed look, as though trying to prove a point. "Yes, he's being hostile." Silas let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Hostile? Lady, the only thing hostile here is your attitude." The neighbors caught that line, and a couple of them chuckled under their breath. Marjorie spun toward them, her voice sharp. "This isn't a joke. You all know we have rules. You'll thank me later when this man is gone." But the neighbors didn't look convinced. And Silas? He stayed rooted where he stood, calm as ever, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the sound of sirens approaching in the distance promised that the standoff was far from over. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, bouncing off the water and cutting through the heavy summer air. Neighbors edged closer, phones angled discreetly but not discreet enough. The scene had shifted from a simple argument into something everyone wanted to witness. Silas remained on the porch, arms crossed, weight leaning slightly on one leg, as if this were just another day. He looked more amused than threatened, though there was a quiet steel in his eyes that said he wasn't going anywhere. Marjorie, on the other hand, stood rigid, phone still clutched tightly, her chest rising and falling quickly. She turned to the gathering crowd, lifting her voice so everyone could hear. "You see? This is why we have rules, to keep outsiders from squatting on our property. If we let one slip through, what happens next? More people sneaking in, ignoring regulations, lowering property values." Silas cut her off, his voice steady and louder now. "Outsider. Lady, I've been fishing this lake since I was tall enough to hold a rod. My father taught me to cast right down there off the dock. My grandfather cleared this land with his own hands. You're standing in front of the man who owns more ground here than anyone else alive." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. A couple of neighbors exchanged looks, one whispering, "Wait, did he just say he owns the land?" Another pulled up the county property records on her phone, curiosity etched across her face. Marjorie didn't acknowledge the whispers. She locked her eyes on Silas like he'd just insulted her directly. "That's a lie. Pure and simple. No one man owns this much. And if you think waving family stories around is going to change the fact that you're trespassing, you're mistaken." Silas gave her a long look. "You want proof? Fine. When the deputies get here, I'll show them what I've got. But let me warn you, Mrs. Kincaid, when you find out the truth, it's not going to be me standing here embarrassed." That jab landed. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but instead of retreating, she stepped closer, climbing the first step of the porch. "Don't you dare threaten me. I know people like you, men who think they can bend rules to fit themselves. You probably sweet-talked some clerk or took advantage of a loophole, but in this community we follow order." Silas didn't move. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, I don't need loopholes. I've got signed deeds, stamped by the county, filed fair and square. You want to talk order? Order is when people respect the truth, not when they bully others because they don't like what they hear." The neighbors shifted again. One man in a baseball cap called out, "Hey, Marjorie, maybe let the deputies sort this out." No harm in checking the paperwork before making accusations. She spun toward him, voice sharp. "This isn't your concern, Harold. Stay out of it." Harold lifted his palms but didn't back away. "Just saying. The guy doesn't look like he's hiding anything." That little comment only fueled her fire. She turned back to Silas. "You see what you're doing? Undermining authority, stirring doubt, dividing the community. That's exactly what I won't allow." Silas laughed softly. "You're doing a fine job of that yourself." The sirens cut off abruptly as two sheriff's cruisers rolled up the gravel path, lights still flashing. The tension tightened, every eye now fixed on the scene. Two deputies stepped out, hands resting near their belts, scanning the situation. "Afternoon," one called out, his tone professional but cautious. "What seems to be the issue here?" Marjorie immediately straightened, marching toward them like she was leading the charge. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is trespassing on private property. He refuses to leave. He's hostile and disruptive. I demand he be removed immediately." Silas remained where he was, his voice calm but carrying across the yard. "Afternoon, officers. Name's Silas Trenholm. This is my cabin. And before you listen to another word of nonsense, I've got a stack of deeds in that binder inside, proving not just this property, but the land around it belongs to me." The deputies exchanged a look, their expressions shifting from casual to cautious curiosity. One of them raised a hand. "All right, let's take this one step at a time. Ma'am, you'll have your chance. But first, sir, you got identification and documents to back up your claim." "Sure do," Silas replied. He turned, opened the cabin door, and walked inside slowly, returning with the thick binder under his arm. He placed it on the porch rail and flipped it open. The sound of paper and plastic sleeves rustling filled the silence. Marjorie scoffed loudly. He could have printed anything off the internet. That doesn't mean it's legitimate. Silas didn't even look at her. He slid one deed toward the deputy, pointing to the official seal and recording number. Filed at the county office. You can call and confirm it right now. I've got dozens more just like it. The deputy leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he examined the document. He lifted his radio. Dispatch, need a quick check on property records for a Silas Trenholm, Lakeside parcel, recorded May 12th, 2008. The air grew heavier. Neighbors whispered. Phones recorded every second. Silas stood calm, his hand resting lightly on the binder. Marjorie, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, though her mouth still worked, firing off under her breath. Fake, loopholes, manipulation. But as the deputy waited for the response over his radio, the balance of power in the yard began to shift, and everyone could feel it. The crackle of the deputy's radio filled the charged silence. Every head turned toward his shoulder mic as dispatch responded. Copy that. Records show property at Lakeside parcel is listed under Silas Trenholm. Multiple adjoining parcels also under his name. Confirmed. Over. The deputy raised his eyebrows, looking from the document in his hand to the man standing calmly on the porch. Well, he muttered. That checks out. The crowd of neighbors buzzed with low chatter. Phones tilted higher. A woman near the back whispered, Did she really call 911 on the guy who owns the whole place? Another laughed nervously, covering her mouth. But Marjorie wasn't ready to give up. She stepped forward, her voice sharp, carrying over the murmurs. No, that can't be right. He's lying, or there's some mistake in the system. Officers, don't you see what's happening here? He's manipulating the records. People like him find ways to— People like me? Silas interrupted, his tone calm but edged. He fixed his eyes on her, and for a moment the noise of the crowd seemed to vanish. You don't even know me. You didn't ask who I was, didn't ask where I'm from. You saw a man unloading gear at his own cabin and decided I didn't belong. That says more about you than it does about me. The deputy cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Ma'am, the records are clear. Mr. Trenholm owns this cabin and a good deal more land besides. There's no trespass here. Marjorie's face flushed, but she doubled down. I don't care what the records say. This community has rules. We have bylaws, regulations. He's not above those. Silas lifted his binder again, pulling out another set of papers. Actually, I am. Because every road you drive, every path you jog, every dock you fish from, it's all on land that I own. Your association has no authority over me, and it never has. Gasps rippled through the group. Someone in the back muttered, Is that true? Can he really own all that? Another answered, Looks like it. Marjorie's voice climbed higher, teetering on the edge of panic. This is outrageous! You can't let one man control everything. Officers, do something. Arrest him if you have to. One of the deputies raised a hand firmly. Ma'am, that's enough. He hasn't broken any laws. You made the call, we came, and we've verified the property records. Unless you have evidence of a crime, this matter's resolved. Marjorie stared at them in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her grip on the clipboard was so tight, her knuckles whitened. Finally, she blurted, This is harassment! He's harassing me! Silas let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. Lady, I've said less than 10 sentences since you walked up my drive. The only person doing the harassing here is the one shouting at me in front of a crowd. The neighbors chuckled. Even the deputies exchanged a glance, the corner of one's mouth twitching. Marjorie spun toward the crowd, desperate now. Don't you see? If we let him claim all this power, he'll ruin everything we've built. He'll tear apart this community. Property values will plummet. Our rules will mean nothing. But the crowd didn't look convinced anymore. A man holding his phone said aloud, Seems to me the only one tearing the community apart is standing right there with the clipboard. Laughter broke out, low at first, then louder. The sound of it struck Marjorie harder than Silas's calm defiance ever had. She raised her chin, but her eyes darted nervously toward the flashing red light of half a dozen cameras. Silas turned back to the deputies, voice even. Am I free to go about my day now? I was hoping to get some fishing in before dark. The deputy nodded. You're clear, Mr. Trenholm. Sorry for the trouble. You're well within your rights to be here. Silas gave a small nod of thanks. No trouble, officer. Not for me, anyway. The words landed like a stone dropped in water. Marjorie stiffened, her face red as whispers spread through the neighbors like wildfire. She opened her mouth to argue again, but no words came. For the first time that day, she seemed out of breath. The deputies began to step back toward their cruisers, satisfied the situation had been resolved. But Silas knew better. He could see it in Marjorie's eyes. This wasn't over. Not for her. But before the cruisers even pulled away, Marjorie found her second wind, determined to claw back the control that had just slipped through her fingers. The two sheriff's cruisers idled with their lights still flashing, throwing red and blue streaks across the gravel and trees. The deputies hadn't left yet. They were lingering, partly because they sensed the situation wasn't finished, and partly because half the neighborhood had gathered with phones held high. Silas stayed on the porch, binder under one arm, calm as stone. He had nothing left to prove. But Marjorie Kincaid, her cheeks flushed, her jaw tight, wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Officers! She called out sharply, stepping forward, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. You can't just walk away from this. He may have papers, but there's no way one man can own this much land. It's impossible. Check again. One deputy, a broad-shouldered man named Deputy Walker, sighed audibly. Ma'am, we checked. Records are official. Multiple parcels filed under his name, dating back years. That's not a mistake. But Marjorie shook her head furiously. Paperwork can be forged. Clerks can be bribed. I've been running this association for 12 years, and not once has anyone mentioned his supposed authority. If he really owns all this, why's he just now showing up? Silas leaned forward slightly, his voice even but pointed. Because I don't have to answer to you, that's why. I've been coming here for decades, quietly, without needing your approval. And now that I finally decided to spend more time here, you decided I don't belong. That's the only reason we're standing here arguing. The crowd muttered agreement. Someone near the back said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He's right. I've seen him here before. Never caused trouble, the other deputy, a younger man named Deputy Perez, turned toward Marjorie, his patience thinning. Ma'am, I'm going to be direct. Calling 911 for a civil matter like this isn't what emergency lines are for. The man hasn't committed a crime. You've accused him without evidence. If this continues, you could be the one facing consequences. The words hit her like a slap. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. But it vanished quickly, replaced by indignation. You're taking his side. I'm a tax-paying resident, the elected head of this community. You should be listening to me. Silas chuckled softly and shook his head. Funny thing, Mrs. Kincaid. You keep saying this is your community, but the truth is you're standing on mine. Gasps broke out in the crowd. A woman whispered, He said it again, his land. Another man muttered, and he's right. HOA's been running people ragged for years. Marjorie's grip tightened on her clipboard. She pointed a finger at Silas. You think you can just wave some papers around and intimidate me? You won't scare me off. I've fought harder battles than this. Silas straightened, his voice calm but carrying authority. I'm not trying to scare you. I don't need to. The truth does that on its own. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft chirp of the deputies' radios. Then Walker spoke again, his voice measured. Mr. Trenholm, you're clear to stay here. You have every legal right. Ma'am, unless you've got real evidence of wrongdoing, this matter's closed. But Marjorie couldn't let go. She spun toward the crowd, her voice sharp and pleading now. Can't you all see? If he controls everything, he'll destroy what we've built. He'll make his own rules. Marjorie. Harold, the man in the baseball cap, cut in, his voice tired. Maybe stop. You're embarrassing yourself. Laughter rippled through the neighbors. Phones angled closer. The weight of public opinion shifted right there in that moment, and Marjorie knew it. Her face turned crimson. She turned back to the deputies, desperate. You can't just leave me like this. Do something. Perez exchanged a look with Walker, then addressed her plainly. The only one causing a disturbance here is you. If you can't let this go, we may have to cite you for misuse of emergency services. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Marjorie froze, her bravado slipping. The possibility of being cited, her record tarnished, her reputation stained, was the one thing she hadn't prepared for. Silas saw the shift and spoke gently now, almost like he was offering her a way out. Mrs. Kincaid, you could just walk away. Admit you jumped too fast. We've all made mistakes. This doesn't have to go any further. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting to the neighbors' cameras. Pride warred with fear, but pride still held the upper hand. No, she whispered hoarsely. I won't back down. Silas sighed, shaking his head slightly. Then you're about to learn the hard way that power doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from being right. But even as the deputies prepared to wrap things up, the crowd's reaction was only beginning, and the fallout would spread faster than either of them could predict. The heat of the afternoon seemed to press down harder as the moment stretched. Silas stood steady with his binder, while Marjorie clutched her clipboard like it might keep her from unraveling in front of everyone. The deputies were done arguing, but the neighbors weren't leaving. Phones hovered in the air, waiting to catch the next thing said, the next small explosion. Silas flipped open the binder again, slowly this time, letting the sound of plastic sleeves sliding against each other carry through the silence. He pulled out one deed, then another, and laid them across the porch rail like playing cards. Each bore the same bold name. Silas Trenholm. You want to see authority? He asked, his voice even, almost conversational. Here it is. This deed covers the dock down by the water. This one covers the gravel road you drove in on. And this one covers the lot your subdivision sits on. Mrs. Kincaid. All filed legally, all recorded with the county gasps cut through the crowd. One man in the back shouted, "He owns the subdivision!" A woman pulled her sunglasses down, squinting at the papers. Another whispered to a friend, "No wonder he looks so calm." Marjorie shook her head, her voice shrill. "That's impossible!" "If you owned all that, we would have known. The board would have been notified." Silas looked directly at her. "The board doesn't outrank the county courthouse. Just because you didn't know doesn't mean it isn't real." Deputy Walker leaned closer to the papers, his finger tracing the seals. "Everything here looks official. Dates, signatures, recording numbers, they all check out." He straightened and faced the crowd. "As far as the law is concerned, Mr. Trenholm is the rightful owner of all this property. Period." The declaration dropped like a stone into water. Neighbors whispered fiercely, some shaking their heads, others glancing at Marjorie with thinly veiled smirks. One woman, older and sharp-eyed, spoke just loud enough to cut through. All these years of her barking orders, and she never even knew who really held the cards. Marjorie's face went scarlet. She jabbed a finger toward Silas, her voice trembling with fury. "You think this changes anything? Ownership doesn't give you the right to disrupt our order. Our community thrives on structure. On rules." Silas tilted his head, his voice calm but firm. "Rules are fine when they're fair, but when they're used to bully and intimidate, they stop being rules. They become weapons. And I'm not about to let you weaponize this place against me, or anyone else." Murmurs of approval rose from the crowd. A young father holding his toddler muttered, "Finally, someone said it." Marjorie looked around, realizing the support she once counted on was slipping like sand through her fingers. The neighbors who once nodded at her every word now looked skeptical, even amused. Cameras stayed trained on her, their little red recording lights like dozens of tiny spotlights. Deputy Perez spoke carefully. "Ma'am, I'm going to be blunt. At this point, there's no crime here. What I see is a lawful property owner being harassed. I suggest you stand down before this becomes a problem for you." Her lips quivered. For a second it seemed she might relent, but then she snapped her chin up, clinging to what little ground she thought she had left. "You're all blind. He'll ruin everything. You'll regret siding with him." Silas leaned forward on the porch rail, his eyes steady. "You keep saying this is about me, but it's not. It's about you, about how you can't stand not being in control. You called the law on a man minding his own business. You accused me in front of my neighbors. And now the truth's out, and you can't stand it." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Someone clapped once, then stopped when Marjorie shot them a glare. Silas gathered the deeds back into the binder, snapping it shut. "This cabin isn't just a place to fish and rest. It's my family's legacy. You don't erase that with a clipboard and a loud voice. And if you don't like it, well, maybe it's time you rethink what leadership really means." The deputies exchanged one final look. Walker nodded. "We're satisfied. Mr. Trenholm, you're within your rights. Ma'am, I suggest you let this go." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though plenty of phones stayed raised. People whispered as they walked, some shaking their heads, others grinning. For the first time in years, the queen of the HOA had been knocked off her throne. Marjorie stood frozen, the clipboard trembling slightly in her hands, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. She opened her mouth, but no words came. And in that silence, Silas turned, picked up his cooler, and walked back into his cabin like nothing had happened. But while the deputies had closed their books on the matter, the court of public opinion was just getting started, and Marjorie's downfall was about to spread beyond the lakeside. The cruisers finally pulled away, their lights fading down the gravel road, but the echoes of what had just unfolded clung to the lakeside like humidity. Neighbors didn't scatter immediately. They lingered in clusters, their voices low, but their eyes bright with the thrill of having witnessed something worth retelling. Some scrolled through their phones, checking that their recordings had saved. Others sent clips off with quick taps, the events already leaving the driveway and racing toward the wider world. Silas had gone back inside his cabin, setting his binder on the kitchen table like a man setting down a chess piece after checkmate. For him, the matter was finished. He wanted nothing more than to bait his line and watch the sun slip behind the trees. But outside, Marjorie Kincaid's humiliation was only beginning. She stood stiff in the yard, clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes darting from one neighbor to the next. She could feel it, the shift in the air. These were the same people who, just days earlier, nodded approvingly when she handed out violation notices or lectured about trash bins left an inch too far from the curb. Now those same faces looked at her with something closer to amusement. "Guess she barked up the wrong tree this time," someone muttered. The words were followed by stifled laughter. Another neighbor, a woman in a straw hat, spoke openly to the group beside her. "She called the sheriff on the landowner. Can you believe that? 12 years running the HOA, and she didn't even know who held the deeds under our feet." Marjorie's lips pressed thin. She lifted her chin, trying to recover the posture of authority she had worn so easily before. "Everyone calm down," she announced loudly. "This man may have papers, but don't think for 1 second that he can ignore our community guidelines. Ownership doesn't excuse disorder, but instead of nods, she was met with smirks. Harold, the man in the baseball cap, crossed his arms and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Funny, Marjorie. Looked like order to me." He stayed calm while you shouted, "Who's really causing disorder here?" Laughter rippled through the group. Phones caught every second. Someone near the front whispered, "This is going to blow up online." Marjorie's face burned. She pointed her clipboard at Harold. "You watch yourself. This association doesn't tolerate disrespect." Harold didn't budge. "Respect's earned, not forced." That line hit harder than Silas's deeds. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd, a quiet rebellion taking shape. For years, Marjorie's voice had carried the weight of authority. Now, stripped of her certainty, she sounded more like a neighbor grasping at control she no longer had. Inside the cabin, Silas sat at the kitchen table, sipping from a bottle of water, listening to the noise outside fade and swell like waves. He didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He hadn't sought this fight, but the truth had a way of forcing itself into the open. Outside, the crowd thinned at last, though not before several neighbors snapped group photos with the cabin in the background, joking about the landlord of the county. One teenager shouted, "#HOA meltdown," before jogging off down the road. Marjorie was left standing nearly alone, her clipboard limp at her side, her authority evaporating with each retreating neighbor. She turned toward the cabin, glaring at the porch as though sheer willpower might summon Silas back out to continue their fight. But the man didn't appear, and that, more than anything, made her feel small. By the time she stalked back to her SUV, the narrative had already slipped from her hands. Her neighbors had their own version now, one captured in shaky cell phone videos and punctuated by laughter. A story that painted her not as a leader keeping order, but as a bully caught red-handed. She slammed her car door and sat in silence for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to being laughed at, and the sting of it burrowed deep. Meanwhile, across the lake, phones lit up. Videos were uploaded to Facebook groups, shared in local chats, and texted to friends in town. Within hours, clips spread beyond the subdivision, reaching nearby communities who found the tale irresistible. The HOA president who called 911 on the man who turned out to own the whole county. But as the story leaked into the wider world, Silas realized his private life was about to become anything but, and Marjorie was far from finished with her fight. By the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. What had started as a heated argument in front of a handful of neighbors had exploded into something much larger. The videos were everywhere, Facebook groups, local Reddit threads, even circulating through text chains at the diner in Hickory Grove and the coffee shop in Rock Hill. People who had never stepped foot near the lake were suddenly debating the showdown between Silas Trenholm and Marjorie Kincaid. The clips varied in length, but they all had one thing in common: Marjorie's raised voice, Silas's calm replies, and the deputies confirming his ownership. The comments wrote themselves. Classic HOA power trip. She tried to kick out the man who owns her street. Silas handled that better than I ever could. By Saturday afternoon, Silas's name was trending locally. A reporter from the Charlotte Observer left a message on his phone. A podcaster out of Columbia sent an email asking for an interview. Silas ignored them all. He hadn't wanted the spotlight. He wanted quiet mornings on the dock, afternoons with a fishing pole, evenings with a book on the porch. But that privacy had been fractured, and he knew it might not return. Meanwhile, Marjorie was facing a storm of her own. Her inbox filled with emails from angry residents demanding answers. Some wanted to know how she could be unaware of who owned the land. Others were furious she had wasted county resources by calling 911 for what turned out to be nothing. A few even called for her resignation. At the grocery store in town, whispers followed her down the aisles. One man chuckled openly as she passed. "Ain't you the lady who tried to throw out the landowner?" he asked, grinning. She flushed and hurried away. The HOA board called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. The atmosphere was tense, the usual polite nods and greetings absent. One board member, a retired teacher named June Lattimore, laid it out plainly. "Marjorie, you embarrassed this association. You embarrassed all of us, and you've turned neighbors against one another." Marjorie bristled. "I was protecting our community. If we let one man bypass the rules, everything falls apart." But June shook her head. "That one man owns the ground under our feet. You didn't just enforce rules, you tried to humiliate him. And it backfired. The whole county's laughing at us now." The board fell into uneasy silence. For the first time, Marjorie felt the walls closing in. Authority she once wielded effortlessly was slipping through her fingers. Back at the cabin, Silas sat on the porch with his fishing rod propped beside him. A neighbor stopped by, a woman named Carol, who had lived in the subdivision for 20 years. She carried a small basket of muffins and a sheepish smile. "Thought you might like these," she said, handing the basket over. "And maybe an apology. A lot of us went along with the HOA because it was easier, but yesterday, you showed us we don't have to let one person run the show." Silas gave a quiet smile. "Appreciate that. I'm not here to run anybody off. I just want peace." "Same as everyone else," Carol nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Peace doesn't always come easy around here, but you might have started something good, whether you meant to or not." Word of mouth carried faster than the videos. By Sunday, folks who'd never spoken to Silas before were waving from their porches, dropping by to introduce themselves, even jokingly asking if they needed his permission to mow their lawns. He laughed along, but kept his responses short. He knew fame, even local fame, was a fire you didn't feed unless you wanted it to burn brighter. Marjorie, however, was cornered. At church that weekend, the pastor offered a sermon about humility and listening before speaking. The message wasn't aimed at her, but every glance in her direction made it feel that way. She sat stiffly, refusing to look at anyone. By Monday morning, a petition was circulating to remove her as HOA president. Signatures piled up quickly. People who once tolerated her rigid enforcement now saw her as a liability, someone who had dragged their community into national ridicule. And through it all, Silas kept fishing, kept tending his cabin, kept his grandfather's knife on the table inside. He didn't gloat, didn't fan the flames, didn't answer the reporters' calls. He simply lived the way he always had, quiet, steady, rooted in the land that was rightfully his. But late one evening, as the sun dipped low and the lake turned gold, Silas found himself reflecting on what the whole ordeal really meant, and the lesson hidden inside all the shouting and laughter. The lake was calm that evening, its surface a mirror catching the last streaks of orange and pink before night fully took hold. Silas sat on the edge of the old wooden dock with his boots dangling just above the water. His fishing rod lay beside him, forgotten for the moment. Instead, he held his grandfather's pocket knife in his palm, flipping it open and closed with the slow rhythm of thought. The weekend hadn't gone as he planned. He'd wanted peace, silence, the kind of stillness that only came from water lapping against the shore and wind pushing through pine trees. Instead, he had been thrust into a spotlight he never wanted. Yet as he sat there, listening to frogs begin their evening chorus, he realized the chaos had forced him to face truths he had been ignoring. He thought back to the look in Marjorie Kincaid's eyes when the deputies confirmed his ownership. Anger, yes, but underneath it something else. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear of losing control. He'd seen that look before, in clients who refused to admit a mistake, in men on job sites who hated taking orders from someone younger. Control was a powerful drug, and once someone tasted it, they clung to it with both hands. Silas ran his thumb along the knife's handle. Funny, he muttered to himself. Owning all this land, and I never once felt the need to lord it over anybody. But she thought a clipboard gave her a crown. The truth gnawed at him. It wasn't just about land or property lines, it was about the way people treated each other. Too often, folks jumped to conclusions, let pride blind them, or believed authority gave them the right to trample over others. He remembered his father's voice, rough and steady, teaching him years ago out on this very dock. Respect is simple, son. You give it until someone proves they don't deserve it. And even then, don't waste your time with shouting. The truth's got a way of doing the shouting for you. That advice had never felt more real. Silas hadn't needed to raise his voice once. He hadn't needed to wave his deeds around like a trophy. All he did was stand still and let the truth sit there in plain sight. And it had done the work for him, but he also knew something else. Humiliation cut deep. Marjorie's pride had taken a blow, and a wounded pride often came back swinging. He doubted she would let this go easily, and yet part of him hoped she would learn from it, just as he had learned something from her. Because the lesson wasn't only hers. Silas realized he had been too quiet for too long. He'd built a life around staying in the background, moving slowly, keeping to himself. That approach had served him well when buying land, when building his career. But it also meant he had let others tell the story of the community, while he kept his own head down. Now, by accident, his story was out in the open, and people were listening, not because he wanted them to, but because they had seen something different in him. Calm where others shouted, steadiness where others panicked, truth where others twisted facts. He sighed, flipping the knife shut. Maybe that's the real lesson, he whispered. Doesn't matter how much land you own. What matters is how you stand when someone tries to take your place. The crickets grew louder as night settled in, and Silas leaned back on his hands, staring at the sky turning from orange to deep purple. He thought about his neighbors, the ones who had stopped by with muffins, the ones who had whispered support in the crowd. People were tired of being told what to do by someone who mistook power for leadership. Maybe they were ready for something better, not more rules, but more respect. He didn't want a title. He didn't need recognition. But if his story, caught on shaky phone videos and shared across town, gave people the courage to question authority when it went too far, then maybe the embarrassment of the weekend had been worth it. Silas stood, pocketknife tucked back into his jeans, and picked up his rod again. The water rippled gently as he cast his line into the fading light. The world had changed around him, but the lake remained steady, quiet, eternal. But even as he settled back into the rhythm of fishing, the story outside the lake was still spinning, and it was clear the final chapter hadn't yet been written. By the middle of the following week, the story had spread further than anyone around the lake could have imagined. Clips of the confrontation showed up on TikTok, stitched with commentary from people who had never heard of Lakeview but suddenly had an opinion about HOAS. On Facebook, entire threads debated whether Marjorie should resign. On YouTube, a video titled HOA President Calls 911 on the Man Who Owns the County pulled in hundreds of thousands of views in just a few days. Silas didn't watch most of it. He had no appetite for the online circus. Instead, he kept to his cabin, working on small repairs, clearing brush, and slipping his boat onto the water when he wanted quiet. But he couldn't ignore the constant buzz of messages from friends, old co-workers, even distant relatives who had stumbled on the viral clips. Some laughed, some congratulated him, and some warned him to be careful, because fame, even accidental fame, came with a cost. For Marjorie, that cost was steeper. By Thursday, the HOA board had held another emergency meeting. This time, dozens of residents showed up, not to support her, but to demand accountability. Voices rose. One man shouted, "You embarrassed us all." Another woman waved her phone in the air, playing the clip of deputies confirming Silas's ownership. "You made us look like fools," she said, her voice trembling with anger. The board voted. Not unanimously, but decisively enough. Marjorie was stripped of her role as president. The clipboard that had once symbolized her authority was now nothing more than a piece of plastic tucked under her arm as she walked out of the meeting hall in silence. Back at the cabin, Silas learned about it from a neighbor who stopped by to share the news. He listened quietly, nodding once. "I never wanted her job," he said softly. "And I still don't. I just want to be left alone." But the neighbor smiled knowingly. "Maybe so. But whether you like it or not, people see you differently now. They see you as someone who stood up without shouting, someone who proved you can fight back with facts and dignity. That matters." Silas didn't respond right away. He looked out across the lake, the water catching the reflection of the fading sun. He thought about his father, about his grandfather, about the knife still resting on his kitchen table. Legacy wasn't just about land or ownership. It was about teaching people, by example, what it meant to carry yourself with quiet strength. That weekend, kids rode their bikes past the cabin, waving at him like he was a local celebrity. Parents smiled and said hello, some of them stopping to ask questions about the history of the land. A few admitted, sheepishly, that they had once believed every word Marjorie said without question. But after what happened, one man admitted, we realized maybe we'd given too much power to someone who didn't know how to use it. Silas accepted their words with the same steady calm he had shown throughout the ordeal. He didn't gloat, he didn't brag. He simply lived his life as he always had, proving by his actions what his deeds had already made clear. In the end, the story wasn't about land deeds or HOA bylaws. It was about pride, truth, and the way people treat one another. It was about what happens when authority is used as a weapon instead of a responsibility. And it was about the power of standing firm, even when the crowd, the rules, and the loudest voices are against you. Silas knew that one day the internet would move on to something else. The videos would fade, the jokes would be recycled, and the headlines would disappear. But for the people who lived around that lake, the lesson would stick. They had seen what happened when someone tried to bully the wrong man. They had seen that calm, truth, and patience could win against arrogance and noise. As Silas sat once again on his porch with his fishing rod beside him and the evening breeze drifting through the trees, he felt a quiet sense of closure. Not victory, he had never wanted a fight, but clarity. A reminder that standing on the side of truth doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just requires not moving when someone tries to push you off your own ground. And maybe that's the real lesson worth sharing. Respect isn't about rules or titles. It's about listening before you judge, speaking carefully before you accuse, and remembering that the loudest voice isn't always the right one. If you enjoyed this story and believe more people should hear lessons like this about standing your ground, about the danger of pride, and about the power of quiet strength, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us not just of what people can do, but of who we can choose to be. Because in the end, truth has a way of speaking for itself. And when it does, it speaks louder than any clipboard ever could.